Consider 15 years after 9/11, the state of the fight against Islamic terrorism. All of us marked the 15th anniversary last week of the attacks of 9/11. That was an opportunity to remember and honor the victims of those attacks. It was also an opportunity to remember and honor all of those who have sacrificed to prevent a recurrence of 9/11. But it gives us, I think, not only an opportunity but an obligation to look back on these 15 years and look at the state of the fight against terrorists. What has worked? What hasn't? How is the threat changing? Are we adaptable to meet the change of the threat? My view is that the people in the military, the intelligence community, and law enforcement have done an incredible job to prevent another successful attack on the scale of 9/11. But the rest of the story is we have been lucky. Some of the bombs just didn't go off because they weren't constructed appropriately. Just the events of the past few days remind us how this threat is changing and how difficult it is to detect it and prevent it as well. In my view, we still have not dealt effectively with some of the root causes. We have not effectively dealt with the ideology that radicalizes people here and around the world. And it is essential moving forward that we not just try to muddle through, contain, try to prevent a catastrophe, but that we have a strategy that will be successful in dealing with the threat as it is evolving. As you all know, ISIS says even if it loses its physical caliphate, it will pursue a virtual caliphate. One of the questions for us, are we ready to deal militarily and otherwise with a virtual caliphate? So we face, I think, a number of serious challenges in our responsibility to keep the American people safe. We have some outstanding witnesses to help guide us through those challenges. But first, I'll turn to the ranking member for any comments he'd like to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I think it's a very appropriate hearing to gauge 15 years later where are we at in fighting the groups that attacked us on 9/11 and the ideology that is behind it. And I think the chairman laid out fairly well the challenges that we face. Post 9/11, we took a very clear look at it. We had a clear group of folks in Al-Qaeda that were challenging us, and we went after that network. And I think we went after that network fairly effectively. I think it was General McChrystal at the time who said it takes a network to defeat a network, and we pulled together all the different elements of U.S. power and our allies with the intelligence, law enforcement, military, and built a very sophisticated operations center and tracked this group, first, of course, in Afghanistan, then into Pakistan and Yemen and elsewhere, and have done a successful job of taking out their leadership and of minimizing their ability to move forward. What we have not been successful at is turning back the ideology, and that is where other groups have popped up. And whether it's Al-Qaeda or ISIL or Ansar al-Sharia or any of Boko Haram, dozens of different groups that adhere to this nihilistic, violent death ideology. That ideology has, quite honestly, spread since 9/11. There are more people adhering to it now than there were then, and that is the great threat. And that is what we have seen in Europe and here. Is people not directly affiliated with Al-Qaeda or ISIL or any of these other groups, but simply pledging allegiance and going off and committing violent acts in their name. Now, in some cases, these are people who have bought into the ideology, but even more frightening, it's now seems like this ideology is the last refuge for every sort of violent loser and loner in the world. Some of these folks, you go through their history, they haven't had much of a connection to this. They just wanted to act out and used this as an excuse to commit violent acts and threaten the lives of others. So I think the most interesting question for this hearing is, how do we turn back that ideology? and this is particularly important for our work with the Muslim world. How do we promote the more peaceful brand of Islam that the overwhelming majority of people in that religion adhere to, and work with them to defeat the ideology? And the last thing I'll say is I think that is a challenge, because this is what Osama bin Laden wanted. He wanted a war of civilizations. He wanted the West versus Islam. And every time we take a look at this and cast a broad net and cast aspersions against the entire Islamic religion, we only empower Al-Qaeda and ISIL in their message. We have to find a way to work with our friends in the Muslim world, and both at home and abroad, to confront this ideology and turn it back. And yes, I think we have to continue the military aspect of it as well. If there are specific groups that are plotting and planning against us, we need to know about it and stop them from carrying out those threats. But that is but one piece. The larger and more difficult piece, and what I want to hear about is, what's our strategy for rendering the ideology neutral? Ultimately, that's what won the Cold War for us, is we proved that communism was a failed ideology. And not only did the Soviet Union collapse, but with the exception of a couple of isolated places in the world, communism collapsed. The entire idea behind it collapsed. And before we are successful in this struggle, the ideology that Al-Qaeda and others have advanced is what we're going to have to defeat, and what is ultimately going to have to collapse. And I don't personally have any easy answers for that. Certainly I know some things we should be doing, but I look forward to hearing more about how we can approach that. And with that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Let me welcome each of our witnesses. We appreciate you all being with us and the insights that you will deliver. We're pleased to welcome Honorable James Jeffery, who has been U.S. Ambassador to both Turkey and Iraq. Mr. Bryan Jenkins, Senior Advisor to the President of RAND, a frequent witness over the years on these topics. And Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Brian Price, who happens to be the director of the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, but he's not here representing the Combating Terrorism Center or the Army. He's here only in his personal capacity as an academic and terrorism expert. So we, again, thank y'all for being here. Without objection, your full written statements will be made part of the record. Ambassador Jeffery, we're pleased to recognize you for any comments you'd like to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ranking Member, thank you very much for holding this hearing on the 15th anniversary, particularly given the events, as you mentioned, in the last week. The fight against Islamic terrorism in its various manifestations is both a key element of our national security and a central component in the effort to stabilize the larger Middle East. I would like to touch briefly on where we are and, in response to your questions, where we may be going on this campaign in a very broad brush. This and the last administration's combination of playing defense, protecting the homeland, and going on the offense, both with military action and in the effort to deal with the political roots and psychological and cultural and religious roots of terror, all in all is a good model, and we should stick with it. Nonetheless, as you've just indicated, there are problems with what we've done up to now in our success so far. Homeland defense, all in all, high marks. On military action, directly and with partners, the record is mixed. The U.S. was slow countering ISIS's rise, and we didn't react as quickly to events in Syria that have led to a major increase both in ISIS's terrorist threat and in the underlying dysfunctionality of the region that feeds terror of all sorts, including terror supported by Iran, which is a major factor that I'll touch on in a second. In terms of the root causes of terrorism, as the ranking member said, this is not something that we can do directly. This is something the region has to do itself, and if we try too hard to do it, it tends to be counterproductive as someone who spent 20 years in the region. But there is much that we can do, and that's what I would like to talk about right now. First of all, this is going to take a lot of time. As we all know, we're already 15 years into it, and the roots of this problem stretch back decades before 2001. The military element, while it cannot solve this problem, is critical both in defending ourselves, limiting the expansion of terror, and stopping the creation of new ungoverned zones. You create an ungoverned zone by one or another breakdown of order in the Middle East, and we have more than a half a dozen right now, you will get ISIS, Al-Qaeda, or other terrorist groups, from Hezbollah in southern Lebanon to the Sinai, to Gaza, to the Fatah of Afghanistan, Somalia, Libya, on and on. These are breeding grounds for a huge threat, not just to us through terror, but to the basic structure of the region. Now, military operations, this committee and the American people have discussed a lot over the past 15 years. They don't have to be large-scale, costly, or high casualty, but we have to thread the needle. If we try to transform the region, and to some degree we tried to do that in the last administration and in this administration with the surge in Afghanistan and with Libya, we tend to go too far, overshoot the objective, and it doesn't work out. On the other hand, when we pull ourselves back and don't respond, as I said, as we did initially with ISIS, as we've done in Syria, we see the problem just morphs, the problem just metastasizes without American presence. So you have to thread that needle, enough military force, but not too much to challenge the American people's patience and sensitivities in the region. Those sensitivities are important if we're going to work with folks in the region, and in the end, they're responsible for the kind of cultures they have, the truces they have among themselves, and how they deal with the rest of the world, including us and Europe. There's a lot of work to be done. We can help, but only on the margins. But there are a few things we need to keep in mind. First of all, only a few people in the Middle East really endorse this kind of extreme terrorist violence. A much larger percent of the population, however, accept views of Islam that are orthodox, that are quite strong, that include Sharia, and basically challenge modernity in some ways. That means that the path we're on is very thin. We have to be sensitive. Sensitivity can go too far. One of the things that I'm concerned about is we seem to avoid speaking publicly of this threat as an Islamic terrorist threat. It is an Islamic terrorist threat. I'm very, very sensitive to not generalizing, as the ranking member said, but if we try to hide this, people in the region, Muslims know what's behind this. They know this is a struggle for the region. And to play this down, frankly, doesn't play very well in our own population or in a population in Europe, and it's very important to keep those people behind us. We have to support the governments of the region, recognizing that often they're going to be imperfect partners. But it's not just that they're the partners we have, they're the only basis we can use to work against terror, but also partners throughout the region are watching how we deal with in Egypt, how we deal with in Iraq, how we deal with the leadership, again, however imperfect they are. We have to not only say what we are against, but what we're for. The United States stands since 100 years for an international order based on certain laws, national sovereignty, national unity, peaceful resolution of disputes, and the sanctity of borders. That's an important message also in the Middle East, because all of these are being challenged by movements close to our supporting terror. Finally, our campaign must also focus on Iran. Iran simply is not an acceptable partner in the war against terror, despite a recent article published in the United States by the Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif to that end. The theocratic Iranian regime's Islamic roots have much in common with Sunni Islamic extremism. It uses terror itself, including here in Washington. It has relations with al-Qaeda and Taliban elements, and undercuts international order and sovereignty, and thus provides a breeding ground for terror of all sorts. But in particular, and we saw this in Iraq repeatedly, regional states generally view Iran as a greater existential threat than Sunni Islamic terror. There is thus a real danger that if the Sunni-Shia conflict now seen in Syria emerges region-wide, our Sunni partners could see violent Sunni Islamic movements not as threats, but as allies against Iran. Mr. Chairman, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Jenkins.
Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, members of the committee, thank you very much for inviting me to address this important issue. 15 years of U.S. efforts to destroy the jihadist terrorist enterprise have not led to victory in the classic military sense. Such victory may not be achievable in this kind of war. Instead, our counter-terrorist efforts have achieved successes in some areas, far less so in others, in what is likely to be an enduring task. On the plus side, our worst fears, as you pointed out, have not been realized. There have been no more 9/11s, none of the worst-case scenarios that post-9/11 extrapolations suggested. The operational capabilities of al-Qaeda and ISIL remain limited. The vast majority of Muslims express negative views toward both jihadist organizations, but even a very low percentage of favorable ratings still represents, in actual numbers, a large reservoir of potential recruits. The constellation of jihadist groups is less than it appears to be on a map. To be sure, al-Qaeda and ISIL have sought declarations of loyalty from local groups across Africa and the Middle East, and have established a host of affiliates, provinces, and jihadist footholds. This is growth by acquisition and branding. These partners share a banner, but are focused for the most part on local quarrels rather than a global jihad. There's no central command, no joint operations. ISIL has lost territory and can be defeated as a quasi-state. Al-Qaeda's central command has been reduced to exhorting others to fight. But these continuing calls on local supporters, terrorist supporters in the West, to take action have thus far, despite the occasional tragic event, have produced only a modest response. However, right now, large volumes of homegrown terrorists and returning foreign fighters pose a significant threat to our allies in Europe. In the United States, fortunately, the number of homegrown terrorists remains far less. I believe that Americans are safer now than they were on 9/11 in the 15 years since jihadist terrorists. And since 9/11, jihadist terrorists have been able to kill fewer than 100 people in the United States. True, we have been lucky. And while every death is a needless tragedy, this is a far better result than certainly was feared or expected immediately after 9/11. On the minus side, the targets of the American-led campaigns have survived intense U.S. counterterrorist efforts. Al-Qaeda and ISIL have been cornered, not crushed, and we can't claim to have dented their determination. The jihadists have a powerful ideology, as both of you have mentioned. It arouses extreme devotion. However, that ideology, which we have not yet effectively countered, has fortunately gained little traction in most Muslim communities, especially here in the United States. Personal crisis is the dominant attribute of most American jihadists. ISIL has made more effective use of social media to reach a broader audience, but its advertisement of atrocity makes it a magnet for marginal and psychologically disturbed individuals. The Taliban remains a formidable foe. The continued deployment of U.S. forces will be necessary to prevent their comeback. The fighting in Syria and Iraq will go on for the foreseeable future. Foreign powers cannot impose peace from the outside. Faced with the loss of territory, ISIL will not quit. The leaders of ISIL fought clandestinely for years and will go underground again to continue the struggle. Syria and Iraq will remain fragile states, sources of continued violence, regional instability. The current partitions are likely to persist. The big problem is going to be that the Sunni areas in both countries could become a persistent badlands. The world will be dealing with the effluence of these conflicts for years to come. The thousands of foreign fighters who have joined ISIL cannot survive in an underground campaign. Indeed, the construction of the Islamic State could bring about a spike in terrorist activity by its scattering veterans. Refugees pose a long-term challenge. Those going to Europe right now include a large proportion of single young men coming from violent environments with little education. They already are the targets of radicalization. The primary threat to the United States will come from the ability of al-Qaeda or ISIL to inspire attacks by self-radicalized individuals here. The United States is now better organized and equipped to combat terrorism, but America's frightened, angry, and divided society remains the country's biggest vulnerability. So after 15 years, there has been progress, but we are not through it yet.
Thank you, sir. Colonel Price.
Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the committee, I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I've been asked to reflect on the state of our counterterrorism fight since 9/11 and provide some lessons learned over the past 15 years. As an active duty officer, my testimony is based on my academic work and my personal and professional experiences. I am here today in my personal capacity, and my testimony should not be taken to represent the views of the United States Military Academy, the Army, or the Department of Defense. Congressional hearings like this allow us to reflect and critically analyze where we are in this conflict. I can tell you that our enemies are doing the same. In my written testimony, I highlighted a 50-page 2008 lessons learned document produced by the precursor organization to the Islamic State that shows our enemies are in this for the long haul and are serious about learning from their mistakes. My written testimony contains a list of our many counterterrorism successes, as you just heard from my fellow panelists, but I want to focus my oral testimony on lessons learned for the future. To begin, the threat has evolved and metastasized in ways few could have predicted after 9/11. Today, the threat posed by jihadist terrorism is more geographically diffuse, decentralized, and unpredictable than it was on September 12, 2001. Nobody could have predicted that the greatest terrorist threat to the United States 15 years later would not be al-Qaeda, but its rival, the Islamic State, which now governs territory inside 2 sovereign nations. This reality should give us pause about the unpredictable nature of the threat and the challenges we face in combating it. So what is the best way to conceptualize this threat moving forward? Unsettling as it may be, one alternative is to view this threat not as a war, but as a chronic disease like cancer. In other words, it may be worth viewing the fight against jihadism not as a national security threat that can be solved, defeated, or vanquished, but as an inevitable fact of modern life that can be managed and contained, but never fully eliminated. With that in mind, I offer a few lessons learned to improve U.S. counterterrorism efforts in the future. First, in my opinion, I think we need to do more in articulating realistic public expectations about the threat posed by terrorism and our ability to combat it. It is impossible to stop all attacks in a free and open society, and not every terrorist attack represents a political failure, nor are they existential threats to our national security. These subtleties are often lost in the public discourse, which leads to unwarranted fear, divisiveness, and knee-jerk decision-making. Unfortunately, ridding the world of every jihadist is just as fanciful as ridding the world of every criminal or racist. Acknowledging this is not a sign of weakness, it is a sign of pragmatism. Number 2, decapitation tactics must be a part of a broader strategy. Targeted strikes by unmanned aerial systems are often the most lethal and precise methods that counterterrorism officials can use without putting American servicemen and women in danger. But they are not sufficient by themselves to defeat highly capable groups like al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. On the positive side, I've done research in this. My research analyzing 207 groups from 1970 to 2008 showed that killing or capturing the top leader significantly increased the mortality rate of terrorist groups. But timing matters. Decapitate a group in the first year of its existence, and it is more than 8 times more likely to end than groups that have not been decapitated. The effect is halved in 10 years and potentially non-existent after 20 years. Decapitation strikes are not a silver bullet solution. They must be a part of a broader strategy. 3, we should acknowledge that the military will be a critical part of any effective CT strategy moving forward, but it is only one part, and it may not be the most important part for long-term success. I've had the privilege of briefing many of our nation's top counterterrorism officials over the past 4 years, and in these engagements, there has been one common refrain: we cannot kill or capture our way to victory. Our military is the best in the world at taking out terrorists, but long-term success in this conflict lies in altering the socio-political dynamics in the region. Otherwise, this conflict will be without end. 4, future CT strategy should do more to leverage public-private partnerships in the war of ideas. Lamenting on the slow progress that the U.S. was making in this domain, the late Richard Holbrooke once asked, "How can a man in a cave," meaning Osama bin Laden, "out-communicate the world's leading communications society?" Our difficulty in this domain stems from 2 inescapable challenges. The first is overcoming the credibility gap that the United States has in strategically communicating these issues. Simply put, prospective jihadists do not turn to the U.S. government for career advice. The second is that government bureaucracy invariably produces a slower, more risk-averse, and uninspiring approach to counter-messaging that does not incentivize creativity, experimentation, or risk-taking. One fix for this is more public-private collaboration. The government is incentivized to fund such programs, but it does not have the credibility to be the primary messenger, and it lacks the latest marketing and advertising capabilities. Whereas the private sector, to include non-governmental organizations, often has the credibility and the requisite competencies to deliver the message, but it is not financially incentivized to do so. Last, in my opinion, we need to find more systematic and dedicated means of understanding our enemy and exposing their hypocrisy to the world. The best way to do this is to use their own words against them. These functions can be accomplished with more aggressive efforts to declassify captured battlefield documents after they've already been exploited for their tactical and operational value and made available to academic institutions like the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point. Thank you for this opportunity to testify, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. A lot of things I'd like to follow up on, but let me just backtrack for a second. You've all touched on this, but I'll just ask directly. Looking back at the first 15 years, what is the most significant way that the terrorist threat to us has changed? Looking back 15 years, looking ahead 15 years, what do you think the most significant change in the terrorist threat to us will be? And then the third part of that is, are we prepared to deal with that change you see coming? So what's the most significant way it's changed in the past 15 years? Biggest way it'll change in the next 15, and are we ready for that change, I guess? Ambassador?
Tough questions, Mr. Chairman. I would say over the past 15 years, the thing that is most significant is terrorist movements have been able to exploit the changes and the challenges of the broader Middle East very effectively. A good example, the best example perhaps, is the Arab Spring. That wasn't generated by radicals, let alone terrorists, but basically people who wanted a better civilization and, in many respects, closer to the West, thus seemingly a good idea. The result has been, in Syria, parts of Egypt, Libya, and Yemen, and on the margins in other countries, a decrease of state authority, and who fills the gap? Terrorist groups. Their ability to exploit this underlying set of malignancies in this region is extraordinary. And I think that's the lesson at the strategic level I take from this. 1,001 things that work and things that don't. But that, getting to the second question, what will happen? The risk is not that this will just continue, because believe me, it will. The risk is that they hit a home run. We almost saw that with ISIS as it consumed a third of Syria and a third of Iraq in 2014 and didn't look like it was going to be stopped. We can't have one or two more of those without bringing the whole region into a strudel of chaos and dysfunctionality, and then it will really morph in ways that we can't imagine at this point. How do we deal with this? Again, what the three of us have said. You can't directly deal with the core sociological, religious roots of it, but you can deal with the manifestations of it. I would just advocate you have to deal aggressively with it. And one of the rare things here, I would disagree a bit with Colonel Price, although I think I was saying almost the same thing as him, but I would be careful about this idea of the goal of containing ISIS. or other terrorist movements. In the end, that's what we're going to accomplish. But if we set out to contain these movements, they'll beat us. If we set out carefully to destroy them, we'll probably succeed in containing them. And I think that the history of our relationship with ISIS from January 2014 to late 2015 is a good illustration of that. So we need more aggressive action and willingness to take risks, not only in our public message, but in our military and diplomatic activities. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Ms. Jenkins.
I think that a couple of significant changes in the last 15 years. First of all, the adversary is now broader, more diffuse, more complex. A lot of that, as Ambassador Jeffery has correctly pointed out, in my view, is a consequence of what the so-called Arab Spring. That itself is a symptom of a fundamental turmoil that's going on in this region, and we have to deal with it, but we are on the margins of being able to intervene to change things fundamentally. We simply don't have the resources to do that. The other thing that is clear in the last 15 years is that our adversary here has been the beneficiary of these events. They would probably claim of the beneficiaries of God's will. But they have proved to be extraordinarily adaptive, able to morph to meet new circumstances. That is much more difficult for us to do. We are reacting. With regard to the next 15 years, first of all, I'm glad you said the next 15 years, because I think we have to realistically think of time horizons in those terms. This turmoil that we see now is going to go on. I think the ambassador is correct in underscoring that state authority in this area has weakened. That's clearly the case in Syria and Iraq, where power on the ground has shifted from national institutions to militias that are under foreign or local, not central government control, and rebel formations that challenge that. That is happening completely across the region. In dealing with that and accepting a long-term thing, I think we have to be very, very careful about picking our tasks very, very carefully. I would agree with the ambassador that we have to destroy the Islamic State. So long as that exists, without any illusions that the fight stops if we destroy the Islamic State, it has to be. I'm going to sound like the ancient Senator Cato on this, and furthermore, the Islamic State must be destroyed, but it has to be. It continues to be a source of propaganda, an attraction for these fighters. And in addition to destroying it, I think we really do have to try to, for those that want to go down and make it their final fight, we have to close that ring around them and give them the opportunity to do so. Better to do it there than to deal with tens of thousands of them scattered across the globe. In terms of our own actions going forward, there's not going to be a single strategy that any of us can determine now that events over the next 15 years won't oblige us to revise and alter as new circumstances arise. That's the feature of a long conflict. But a couple of principles ought to continue, and that is, since it is going to be long, whatever we do, we have to be able to sustain it for a long time. So we have to be careful not to overcommit. At the same time, what we have learned again and again is prematurely walking away from these things, whether it's in Iraq or Yemen or Afghanistan, that just risks a comeback by the adversaries that we've already successfully contained. So,
Okay, thank you. Colonel Price.
Mr. Chairman, in terms of answering those questions, I agree. They're all three tough questions. In terms of what happened in the past 15 years, and what's changed, I guess first I should just mention that my discussion of containment earlier does not make me think that we should not go on the offensive and attack the Islamic State. I guess my fear, though, is if we focus too much on defeating the Islamic State, and if we are unable to do that, what does that mean in terms of our counterterrorism credibility moving forward? And even, I would argue, if you killed every single last member of the Islamic State, the ideology that is behind them is just going to mean it's going to be other groups that are going to enter the fray. In terms of the structural conditions that have changed in the past 15 years that I think are most important, I would echo my panelist, Mr. Jenkins, when it talks about the geographical diffusion. September 12th, the threat was largely contained to the AfPak region and some other pockets. Today, it stretches from Western Africa all the way through the Middle East, the Levant, South and Southeast Asia. And so that has been, is obviously a challenge for U.S. counterterrorism. The second that has not been mentioned, but you mentioned in your opening, sir, was the internet, the virtual caliphate, if you will. I think that has really changed the jihadist landscape over the past 15 years and is also one of the things that I think presents the most challenges to us moving forward. The other thing I would argue in terms of the next 15 years that poses the greatest challenge is the exploitation of jihadists to exploit lack of governance or governance issues in places around the world. And so those two things have brought a very broad tent. A lot of people are gravitating towards that type of ideology. How should we fix those, or what are the most promising ways to fix those moving forward? I think there's promise on the internet side of the house, and I think this goes back to my point earlier about public-private partnerships, and I know that our government is already working with the private sector to work around some of these issues. I can tell you that jihadists, particularly online, are very aware of the rules and limitations that they have in order to not come on the radar, and they're also getting more adept at communicating via the dark web. And then the final challenge is, and this has been echoed by both Ambassador Jeffery and Mr. Jenkins, but going back to the issue of lack of governance in these places, I think the United States has found it difficult and challenging in order to affect governance in other places, particularly when some of these countries are not as allied with us like others.
Mr. Smith.
Thank you. Just 2 points I want to pursue. One, I want to pursue the ideology piece of it, but before I get there, I think part of the problem, and Mr. Jenkins mentioned we can't leave too soon from places like Iraq and Afghanistan, but what I've sort of found as we've tried to do this, that sort of imposing an outcome with our military might, whether it's in Afghanistan or Iraq or Libya or Syria or wherever we try to do it, has not proven to be terribly successful, in large part because of the credibility issue that Colonel Price pointed out. Having a Western army in a Muslim country, or a Western military in a Muslim country, just fuels the problem. So I guess the first question would be, how do we get out of that trap? Because it seems like, when you look at the different countries involved, we stay too long, we get out too soon. I mean, I always take the 3 examples of Libya, Syria, and Iraq. In Iraq, we went all in. And we were there for a long time, and I know a lot of people say, well, we got out too soon. I think if we'd been there in those numbers for another 10 years, at the end of those 10 years, people would have been saying we got out too soon. So at some point, like I said, Western military might is not going to force the outcome we want. And I think Iraq proved that, even though some may disagree. In Libya, we decided, okay, we'll go in, we'll take out the leader, but then we'll have less of a footprint. We'll let the locals sort of decide with a little bit of help. That didn't work out. In Syria, we said, for a long time, there's really not much we can do here. Let's not make it worse, and let's stay out. So basically, all 3 methods have ended in failure. Libya, Syria, and Iraq, to all varying degrees, are not where we want them to be in this ideological struggle. So how do we handle that in terms of our presence? And then the second question is, how do we deal with that ideology? How do we make the Muslim world move in the direction? And there are some groups out there that embrace modernity, that are willing to accept other religions, other viewpoints while pursuing their own, because that's the ballgame. Basically, is that there is not a reasonable alternative right now in terms of governance and religion, so that gives fertile ground for these crazy ideologies to grow. So those are the two questions, and Colonel Price, if you could start out, since you sort of touched on those in your opening, what's the best approach to handling that?
Yes, sir. So on the first question, I think the way we will have to move forward and what we've done since 9/11 is realize that this is not a unilateral fight, and that's going to require multilateral efforts in order to make the most effective CT policy. That obviously entails a number of functions, building partner capacity, security force assistance, and those types of programs. But I don't think I have a good answer to come back with the perception problem of having U.S. in those countries. On the second one, how to deal with the ideology, this is more difficult. And in your opening statement, sir, you mentioned some parallels to the Cold War and communism and how we were able to defeat that type of ideology. So I think the major difference that we're talking about here and the threats to the United States in the past century, for when we were defeating fascism and totalitarianism, we defeated that largely on the battlefield. There was no mistake of who was the victor in that fight. When you want to talk about defeating the ideology of communism, that was done via a mix of methods to include the military, but I think a lot of people would say that our economic system had a large part in debunking that. There's not a lot of new nations popping up today trying to have a communist economic system. And so the difference here, though, is when you are talking about jihadists, they do not perceive defeat the way other ideologies do. And so when we defeat them on the battlefield, the lesson that they learn is not that this is a failed ideology. The lesson that they take back is that they were not resolved enough, committed enough to the cause, and that they see this as being a very long-term fight. And the second dynamic, which we can't get around of, is the fact that as long as the United States enjoys a significant amount of power asymmetry over other states, but also specifically non-state actors, the United States will continue to be a convenient foil for non-state actors and jihadists that want to blame the United States for all of their grievances. And so that's why I'm largely so pessimistic about the fight in the long run.
Thanks. Ms. Jenkins, you had mentioned some of those issues. You want to take a stab at that?
You know, I'm not sure that being blamed for the ills of the world is necessarily new territory for us. I mean, the United States is blamed for the world's problems, blamed for not solving the world's problems, and blamed when it tries to solve the world's problems. That comes with the status. Second point is for those who are really committed to this ideology, it would be nice to think we can bring them back in an ideological struggle. I'm somewhat skeptical of that. I think for those who are truly committed, this is a fight. So as Colonel Price correctly points out, I don't know how many Nazis were left in Germany in terms of the mindset at the end of World War II, but it lacked the military capacity to inflict that on other nations. So it was defeated. Insofar as these particular adversaries not accepting that defeat, whether they accept it or not, what we want to do is blunt their capacity to impose it on others. With regard to the various models of U.S. intervention, I don't think under any circumstances, however exquisite our counterinsurgency strategies may be in terms of their sensitivity to local populations, U.S. troops in a foreign country killing local people is not going to be a winning formula. It may be absolutely necessary at times to conduct limited operations, but we ought to avoid that as much as possible. First of all, it's difficult to sustain in terms of American political support, but also we accumulate enemies fairly quickly in trying to do that. So what this means is it's going to be indirect methods. It's going to be working with allies, and it's going to be working with local partners. Now, that's an imperfect way of doing things, and these coalitions and these things are going to be messy, but that is preferable to sending in tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of American forces unless we're really prepared to keep them in for the next half century and to bear the price of doing that. And I'm not even sure it would work then.
I was going to say, I don't think it would work then either. I've taken up quite a bit of time. I want to let others get in. So I'm sure someone will ask a question later on. Mr. Jeffery, you can offer your comments on that, but I want to let other members ask questions, so I'll yield my time.
Mr. Jones.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Mr. Jenkins, I was thinking about your comments. The fact is I'm not an isolationist, but I'm a realist. We're $19.4 trillion in debt. We continue to spend billions and billions of dollars in Afghanistan. I don't know what we're getting out of that, quite frankly, except from time to time a soldier will lose a leg or get killed, and we keep doing it. And I wonder from you three experts, is China concerned about jihadists? I don't think so. And here we are, because of our foreign policy that I blame both parties for. Bush taking out Saddam Hussein was a horrible mistake. Then Obama going in and taking out Gaddafi was another horrible mistake. So here we are, as I think one of you said, and I'm going to stop in just a second. You said that when we get trapped into a situation, they're my words, not yours, that we keep doing the same thing. And all we're doing is enhancing those who hate us with drone strikes and these other strikes that end up killing innocent people. And then that's what they talk about for the next 100 years, just like the Pashtuns in Afghanistan who defeated the Russians. So what kind of foreign policy do you think makes sense instead of going in this direction of spending billions and billions of dollars in a failed policy in Afghanistan, that we will continue to pass bills to keep funding it, and then at some point in time, when we hit $21 or $22 trillion in debt, which might happen in the next 2 years, then our whole country is in an economic collapse. How do you get, say, a Congress to understand what is the right policy versus a policy of keeping to spend, and you get nothing but chaos in Afghanistan? John Sopko has said that corruption is worse today in Afghanistan than it was 16 years ago. To my comments, would you give me a statement in rebuttal, or a statement that I'm somewhat not off track? Mr. Ambassador, I'll start with you.
You're not off track, Congressman. Our national budget and the deficit are core national security concerns. Nonetheless, there's ways to do this over the long term without breaking the bank. There's ways to do it over the long term without, as Mr. Jenkins rightly said, antagonizing those people because we're in Muslim lands killing their people. For example, I did an inventory. We have, from Pakistan to Egypt, in that region, long-term presence in 13 countries. In each country, the presence is relatively minimal, but it is serving a good purpose over the long term, securing things. Taken all together, onshore, it's less than the 28,000 troops we have in Korea since 1950. And that's probably costing us more money than most of what we're doing in the Middle East. But we all understand that on the long run, it buys us and it buys the region security without getting us, at least up until now, in trouble. So that's the only way forward I could point out. You try to limit your commitments to be something that is sustainable in terms of the American public, the budget, and casualties, and also not try to provoke people in these regions. And we have been successful both in the Middle East and elsewhere in the world in doing that. It's not impossible. What is impossible, and it gets to the second question that came up, is changing the region. Because of the concerns you raised, Mr. Jones, people want to somehow rush in and just end this. We don't want to keep being there for decades, so we try to find a solution. We try to get to hearts and minds, and that's where, A, we start sending up the bills. Right now, the fight against ISIS, I think over the last year was $7 billion. I think this committee would know better than I, but somewhere around that. We burned through $7 billion in a few weeks in Iraq for years, and I was there to watch it. So I think that there is a way we can do this, but I realize it's hard to persuade people because this is a very, very good question. Thank you.
Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here and increasing our understanding. In light of the discussion right now, where would you suggest that resources really be focused and directed in a way that perhaps you don't see them being directed today? And could you include with that any additional authorities that you think are required to continue this battle, essentially? I can, Pastor Jeffries, you were going on that vein if you want to focus on it a little bit.
Bearing in mind, having just committed myself to limit the public's resources,
Understanding that, but where should they be that maybe they're not being?
While I'm personally a skeptic about working to try to change the mindset in the region about terrorism, about extremist philosophies and such, it doesn't hurt to try, because I could be wrong and it isn't a lot of money. So that's one place where we are putting a lot of attention with, as you heard so far, limited success, but we might succeed tomorrow. We've done this in other areas, Eastern Europe, for example, successfully, and so perhaps it is certainly worth trying. Secondly, intelligence. That's crucial that we know what is going on out there and who is coming at us as soon as possible. That has helped us a lot in Homeland Defense. That is something that's really vital. Thirdly, supporting this very limited but effective military force who will not be large, who will not be tasked to change the mindset of whole populations, but will be given specific military missions that they can do. We can take out ISIS in Mosul. We want to do it with partners, which is right, but a lot of that will require U.S. leadership, U.S. firepower, U.S. combat experience, and some people on the ground, at least as advisors. That's the kind of thing we have to reinforce as well. But again, if the region is all screwed up, there's nothing we can do to deal with this popping up of new terrorist movements everywhere. So everything we can do diplomatically, politically, economically, and militarily to keep the region in the sort of calm state that we've been so successful elsewhere in the world, from Central and South America to the Balkans, that will help.
Mr. Jenkins, can you respond? Okay.
You know, in all of the questions that have come up thus far, there is an understandable skepticism about what we have received in return for the resources that we have invested, and that reflects the fact that Americans are pragmatists. If we invest something, we want to know what we get in return and how are we doing in this. But in this particular case, that skepticism on the part of Congress, I think, is entirely appropriate, because it in the immediate wake of 9/11, the issue was spare no expense, do whatever we have to do to prevent another 9/11. It's not which button we will press. We will press every single button. One of them has to work. And fortunately, it worked. Combination of what we did and luck. But now, looking for the long haul, we have become more sensitive to both how much we do and how we go about doing that. Part of that is imposed by the terrible costs that we have incurred thus far. But here it underscored the ambassador's remarks in that if you look at the more recent activities where we have worked together with the Kurds or other Arabs in Syria, or we have done more things with special forces, or we have done more things with local partners, military and non-military, the resources there have been a fraction of the terrible price that we have paid if you look back at the previous 15 years, especially the first 10 years after 9/11.
Thank you. Can I let, Colonel, could you just respond quickly then?
Yes, absolutely. I agree with most of what has been said. And in my opinion, the three places to improve, I agree. Intel is one place where you're always getting a great return on your investment. The two places, one cost-efficient one, where I think we can make a lot of room, is in the informational domain. Again, I think the public-private partnerships is the way forward there. The last one is not very cost-efficient, but it has to do with improving governance programs, diplomatic and economic programs to improve governance in the places that are fostering this violence.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank each of you for being here. And Ambassador, in particular, I want to thank you for pointing out that the people of the Middle East really do want to live in the 21st century. Having had the opportunity to visit from Beirut to Amman to Dubai, I explained to my constituents at home that many of these countries, cities, look like Hilton Head on steroids. And so they really want to really be part of the 21st century. And then it's personal to me. All four of my sons have served there. My oldest son was field artillery in Iraq. My second son was a doctor serving in Baghdad. My third son served Bright Star Signal in Egypt. And my fourth guy was an engineer in Afghanistan serving with the local military. And so I'm just so hopeful that we can back them up. But sadly, the legacy of President Obama is failure. By not taking ISIS seriously, by declaring a red line that was not serious, by not having a status forces agreement, to me, he has not learned the lesson of 9/11, which was where there is a safe haven, such as Afghanistan, that the American families are at risk. And we see it even today. I was in New York on Monday, and thank goodness that there were police officers, there were law enforcement, there were first responders, there were National Guard every 5 feet in a city that shouldn't be under siege, but they are. And I want to make every effort that we can to defeat terrorism overseas. And with that in mind, Colonel Price, you've referenced this, and that is that we need to counteract the social media of the Islamic terrorists. And how can we do this best, and what is the role of the Department of Defense?
Sir, so obviously I'm not here speaking on behalf of the Department of Defense, but I can offer some of the academic perspectives in terms of what we can do in the social media realm. And I think this goes back to the public-private partnerships that we can foster in order to do more in this space. What's interesting is that, as I mentioned before, the jihadists are very adept at skirting around the different ways to both communicate, but to do it in a way that is not always illegal. And so I think this will ultimately come down to a policy question of that I'm not really equipped to speak on.
And for each of you, and it could relate to how we address this, and that is, are there legislative authorities that are needed to address the specific aspects of countering the cyber threats to our country?
I don't know it's a matter of legislative authority. I think those authorities are there, and I think we are making some progress. A couple of areas that have already been mentioned that I think we're not fully exploiting. One is, Colonel Price is absolutely correct, there are there's an extraordinary trove of documents produced by al-Qaeda, produced by ISIL, which I don't know why they're classified. I don't see that it's our responsibility to maintain our enemies, protect their secrets. These would be better served in the public domain because I think they would be really instructive. I would make those available. I think another thing that is an underutilized resource is we have some of these people coming back from this experience. We do have, they can be utilized more. I know our tendency is, and it's understandable, this is a nation of law, to say, well, we will lock them up and put them away and forget about them. That's fine, but that is an underutilized resource. And it doesn't make any difference whether we think they are sincere or not, but certainly they, not we, represent the most effective voices against jihad, against radicalization. So among these many hundreds who we have in Europe and here, we could utilize them a lot more in terms of their own propaganda against their own side.
And we look forward to your input. And Ambassador, I want to thank you also. You cited success stories. People need to know. I've just returned from a wedding in Bogota, Colombia. The success of Plan Colombia, it would have been inconceivable, the thought that anybody would have gone to a wedding and feel like they would have been safe. But due to the success of the American military, now that dynamic country of 40 million people is free and dynamic. So thank you for your service.
Thank you. We diplomats will take some credit for Colombia too, Congressman.
Mr. O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to comment on some of the lessons learned that have been described by the panel, all of which are very helpful. Some of which, especially Ambassador Jeffery, you talked about our failure to react in a timely fashion. But I also want to talk about some of those things that we have done in the past that have precipitated some of the problems that we see today, and perhaps looking forward, some of the actions that we can take that could potentially prevent them, that may not be military in nature. And I really appreciate my colleague, Mr. Jones, pointing out that 2003, the invasion of Iraq, set off a chain of consequences, some of them factoring into what we're talking about today. And then the decision to remove Muammar Gaddafi in Libya had some very negative consequences, which we are still dealing with today. There was an interesting article, in addition to the one that Mr. Jenkins contributed to in The Atlantic, published in the New York Times, written by Scott Anderson, How the Arab World Came Apart. And one of the things that he notes is that in these areas where we are concerned about ISIS, in Syria, in Iraq, and in Libya, they all had something in common, which is that 100 years ago, they were creations of the West. They weren't inherently, there was no real Syria, there was no real Libya, there was no real Iraq. And these artificial political constructions could really only be kept together by a strong man. And typically the West would put a strong man of the minority, tribe, or sect in power. And it has produced some of the problems that we see today. This lack of coherence, this lack of national identity, this problem that despite the fact that we spent $60 billion training and equipping the Iraqi army, there was no real Iraqi army, and they melted in the face of a far more insignificant force in ISIS. And so my question is to expand on the excellent question from the chairman. Let's look 15 years back, let's look 15 years forward. Could you look 100 years back and 100 years forward with me? Is there something we could do to facilitate a different political construction in these three countries? The shorthand term for this is partition, but that acknowledges that these are not real countries the way that we think of countries, and acknowledges the sectarian interests, the tribal interests, the familial interests that trump national identity. It may be the least bad option of a number of bad options before us. Convince me why it's not worth exploring and pursuing.
And I think the reality is, as I mentioned in my testimony, that the partitions that we currently see in Syria and Iraq are going to persist. It's not, I know diplomats have to be optimists, and for a variety of reasons, we have to remain committed, at least in theory, to the territorial integrity of Syria and Iraq. The reality on the ground is quite different. Without abandoning the notion that we are in the business of being the new Sykes-Picot people who will now draw new lines in the sand, I do think that it might alter our approach to recognize that reality, and instead of thinking in terms of broad peace agreements that will encompass the entire nation, or governments that will be created that will be able to command the loyalty of all citizens within those territories, that we accept the reality and perhaps go for more modest local accommodations. That is, instead of one grand peace treaty, a series of small steps that are aimed only at lowering the level of violence and allowing some commerce to take place and life to come back to something approaching normality, as opposed to going for these three-point diplomatic shots that we sometimes try for.
If I could very quickly, Congressman, I agree with everything Mr. Jenkins said, but there are two problems with this that I think we need to consider. First of all, other than East Asia, I know of no part of the world where you've got countries with each its own ethnic, religious group, by and large, and a little bit Europe. What you described in the Middle East is absolutely correct, but sub-Saharan Africa saw the same thing without the same level of huge turmoil and generator of terrorism that we see in the Middle East. And in Latin America, again, that was basically one big Spanish set of colonies that then broke apart with very similar ethnic and religious backgrounds, but managed to survive as a set of independent countries. So that's the first thing. It may be that there's a special problem in the Middle East that we don't see elsewhere, and fixing borders won't fix that special problem. The second thing is, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, supporting the international order, national sovereignty, national unity should be our default position because it's what we represent. We can make exceptions to that, as Mr. Jenkins said, and as I was involved in the Balkans, where we helped break up countries. But one requirement that worked in the Balkans and that hasn't worked in the Middle East is, if you're going to do any fiddling inside a country, everybody in that region has to be with you. Because if only one is against you, Syria and Iran with Iraq, Pakistan with Afghanistan, we know all too well in this room what happens. Thank you.
Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Lieutenant Colonel Price, I want to follow up on your written testimony where you talked about what the United States did after major operations in Iraq ceased and our presence there and lack of presence there and what led to the current security situation. We find ourselves now 5 years after that significantly reduced military presence in Iraq. We see what's happening now. I expect in the months to come there'll be another major offensive to perhaps retake Mosul. The question then becomes, what should the U.S. role be to ensure security in Iraq after Mosul is hopefully regained from ISIL?
Yes, sir. So in my testimony, I did discuss that a little bit. Unfortunately, this problem is not unique to the United States. As Ambassador Jeffery pointed out earlier, doing this type of work and finding leverage in other countries to govern the way you would like to govern is extremely difficult. One thing I will say, though, is that I believe that if you take a look at most of the debates surrounding our campaign against the Islamic State today, I would argue that most of those debates are centered around the ways and means of attacking them. Discussions about boots on the ground, troop levels, rules of engagement, airstrikes, building partner capacity, and so forth. I think the real debates need to focus around what happens after. I think the Islamic State, last thing I'll say is that they have created a interesting scenario because they've created a lot of enemies in the region. And so I believe that we're going to be successful in retaking territory. My concern is what happens after, and I would like to see more national debate on that.
Let me ask this, having visited there, went up to Kurdistan, visited with the Kurds, visited with the government in Baghdad, and I use the term government loosely, and seeing what they're dealing with Sunnis and Shias in that region versus the Kurds up north, the disagreements the Kurds have had with this Baghdad government. Is the future one that's likely to hold a country that is not like we saw Iraq previously, with it having those three areas united as one country? Would it be potentially divided where you'd have a Kurdistan, you'd have Shia and Sunni regions that would be regionalized governments, perhaps operating under some centralized government in Baghdad? Give me your perspective about how governance would occur after you regain security. Obviously, security has to happen first, but give me your idea about what what you think it would look like after that.
Yes, sir. There's no really easy answer to that question, and I'd honestly be interested in hearing what Ambassador Jeffery would have to say on this topic. I think the only thing that I will add, and again, this is in my own personal opinion, the key question, whether you're talking about post-hostilities in Iraq or Syria, the key fundamental governance question is, are these states able to provide a alternative and credible form of government that is going to be preferable to living the jihadist lifestyle? Yeah. Very difficult task. I'll cede my time because I defer to my colleague.
Very quickly, to build on Colonel Price's comments, first of all, government in parentheses, you're absolutely right, but that's okay. That's how most of East Asia 40 years ago looked. Corruption, quasi-dictatorial regimes, army generals coming in Korea. Taiwan was a problem. Thailand is still a problem. But we somehow deal with them. The answer to Iraq is it was functioning pretty well in the period of time from the end of the surge, 2009, to roughly 2013. Many factors led to the decline of the state, including a lack of attention by us and increasing sectarian thought and actions, particularly by the largely Shia Arab government against the Sunni Arabs. The Kurds and the Shias kind of work things out in their own unique way. But I would say that you could go back to that. You will have all of the problems that you hear when you're out there, but you have a lot of problems in Egypt. You have a lot of problems elsewhere in the region. It can work. I've seen it work. The most important thing, though, the Delta, is we have to stay in there diplomatically and militarily. That means dealing with Iran, because job one for Iran, as soon as the ISIS battle is over, is to get our 5,000 people out of there. We have to find a way to persuade everyone in Iraq that that's a bad idea, and to some degree to persuade Iran that it's a bad idea in the long run for Iran, too. That's a much bigger problem. I touched on it in my testimony, but it's going to haunt us as long as we're trying to stabilize the region.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Gabbard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just briefly a follow-up to Ambassador Jeffery on that point. Do you think that the very closely and intertwined relationship between the Shia government in Baghdad and Iran can be so easily supplanted by our 5,000 troops on the ground and our engagement there?
Absolutely not, Congresswoman. We have to live with the fact that Iran will have a great deal of influence in Iraq, not just with the largely Shia government and the Shia in the south, but frankly with many of the Kurds in the north. I've seen that as well. The question is, do we want to compete with Iran or turn the place over to them? One of the problems with letting the place split into its three components is the other two components tend to anchor the Shia south in a sort of independent status. If Iran really were in charge, it would have long since picked up the phone and said, why are you exporting up to 4 million barrels of oil a day? This is killing us on oil exports. And believe me, those 2 million additional barrels of oil that Iraq is exporting now compared to a decade ago, thanks largely to us and international oil companies, that's one of the reasons oil prices are so low. That's good for your American consumers, but it's not good for Iran. Iran doesn't do that because it knows the Iraqis would say no. You break that country up, the Shia South is going to have to gravitate into Iran's orbit in a way much more than today. Total oil reserves in Iran and the Shia South of Iraq are greater than Saudi Arabia's. That's something worth combating, and I think we can stay in there, and I think we can push back. But it takes a lot of effort, and it's going to take, again, dealing directly with Iran.
That's a big conversation that we can get into about the three-state possibility for Iraq and the consequence of, as Mr. Jenkins mentioned, the reality on the ground, which is that this partition, in essence, has already taken place, and the vacuum that's been created by the oppression of the Sunni tribes and others by the Shia government has allowed groups like ISIS to, in fact, come in. Which leads me to my next question. Much of the testimony today and much of the talk in the media, much of the conversation from the administration as well as from military leaders on the ground in places like Syria is their mission is to defeat ISIS, period. And when we ask questions about what about al-Qaeda, what about the group formerly known as al-Nusra, what about these other jihadist groups, why are we not targeting them or are we targeting them? And the answers are really insufficient and really speak to the fact that we are not. As a result, groups like al-Nusra, now JFS, have really integrated themselves deeply within Syrian society, right under our noses, to the point where if the administration is successful in removing Assad, the likelihood is that these groups, aka al-Qaeda, would take over, creating a greater threat not only to the region and to the world. Can you speak to the issue of why things have been so completely focused on this group called ISIS rather than recognizing the fact that al-Qaeda still has leading terror groups all around the world, and why more is not being done, therefore, than to take the next step to address defeating the ideology?
I'm not sure that we're ignoring al-Qaeda around the world. I mean, there are continuing efforts and efforts that have achieved a measure of success in reducing the capacity of al-Shabaab in Somalia, an al-Qaeda affiliate. There is an ongoing campaign which the United States is supporting to go after al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, in Yemen, and at least with the air campaign, some of that has been also directed against al-Qaeda's affiliate in Syria. But you do underscore an issue here, and that is that what used to be the performing actor formerly known as Jabhat al-Nusra has in fact become a part of, embedded itself deeply in this broader coalition of rebel forces against them. And it is extremely difficult, and will become more so, for us to precisely target that component without weakening what is essentially still a U.S.-backed broader rebel effort against Assad. All of this comes about because of the fundamental problem, and that is for the Sunni population in Syria, the only avatars they have, the only military defenders they have right now are the Islamic State and this coalition of rebel forces dominated by jihadists. There's not another force in the area that can protect that Sunni population. So we have the dilemma that part of the people we are supporting includes a component of the very people we're against.
Precisely. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Gibson.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the panelists. We heard from you earlier your testimony about how important the competition of ideas is. And also in some of your testimony, you talked about declassification of information, and it caused me to reflect on a very significant experience that I had during the surge. Ambassador Jeffery, you may remember this from Iraq, but in the early summer, General McChrystal and the Joint Special Operations Command had captured a high-value target, and in his debriefing, essentially exposed the fraudulent nature of al-Qaeda in Iraq. At that point, they were really trying to say how this was homegrown, and there were all kinds of Iraqis that were involved in this, and this individual we had captured, he basically said, no, it's all penetrated. It's all foreign. They have one token that's in the lead. And I bring it up because General McChrystal, I think, made a very courageous and smart decision. He declassified all that information first week of July, and I think it was about the first week of July, and that helped us so much. I mean, as the operations officer for everything north of Baghdad, this helped us in Mosul and Tal Afar and Baquba and Tikrit, because we were able to have engagements and say, look what's happening. This is right on the cusp of the Iraqi or the Sunni awakening, moving from the west over to Diyala province, and say, look, these guys are complete frauds. And it really struck me that he was, which is not surprising for General McChrystal, but he was really taking on some risk in declassifying this information and using it in a way that we were targeting with it. And so my question is, looking across now and elevating and thinking about this as a national endeavor, what recommendations do you have as far as laws or guidance on enhancing our agility to declassify, to win this competition of ideas? And in your remarks, any specific recommendations you'd have for either the President and the executive branch or for us from the Congress in terms of congressional delegation trips, messaging, hearings that will help on this score?
Sir, the case study you just mentioned was one that we highlight in the Combating Terrorism Center all the time, because General McChrystal actually gave those documents to the CTC. They're referred to as the Sinjar documents, and they disclosed, like you accurately mentioned, the foreign fighter threat that was going. It was not a homegrown threat. In fact, when we were able to do that analysis on those documents, we were able to determine that when you take a look at the per capita donors from specific countries, I think everyone had assumed that Saudi Arabia was going to be the largest donor at that time, and they were number one on the list. But another state that was number two was Libya. And when we were able to parse out that data down to the actual towns where these individuals were coming from, again, as you mentioned, this is 2007, the two highest per capita were Darna and Benghazi, and this is well before Benghazi was a household name. And so when you talk about what systems are available for us to do this, there is a joint collaborative program between the Combating Terrorism Center along with U.S. Special Operations Command called the Harmony Program, and that was the vehicle by which General McChrystal and others used in order to declassify those. That program is still in function today, and we look forward to getting more declassified documents.
How about other thoughts in terms of how we can get more agile and more effective in this domain, this competition of ideas? Because certainly there's a continuum between speed and effectiveness and protection of sources, and I get all that. But are there any sort of lessons that you can draw out of this that we could really hone in on to be more effective with the whole of government approach?
In my experience, which includes trying to supervise parts of that, underline trying, when I was in the White House, it's very complicated because there are always two reasons why you classify information. One is the actual damage that information might do if it came out into the public sector. But as Colonel Price and you just indicated, Congressman, in many cases it's advantageous for us to have that information out there. The second reason, and that's where you get to bureaucracy, your role, the role of the executive, is sources and methods. That is, it's an innocuous piece of information. It would do good, not bad, if the American public could read it, if people abroad could read it, if you could have access to it freely. But people are afraid because by some algorithm of steps and actions and mathematical formulas, that could somehow reveal how we gather information. I'm less worried about that, I think, than many people are. But this is something that you have to discuss with the intelligence committees and the intelligence community, because they are very ferocious on this, sometimes correctly, sometimes not. But if you want to be fast and agile, you need to look into that specifically.
I think we should. Mr. Nugent?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And you don't paint a pretty picture as to how this is going to be resolved in the future, only because I think the dynamics in the Middle East are so diverse. We've talked about, you know, in Colombia, in other states, where you didn't have the two religious organizations that are the largest in that area, the Shia and the Sunnis, at odds with each other. So how do we ever resolve that issue, which I think, you know, is the underlying issue that percolates up through all of this, whether it's, you know, tribal, but it really goes back to their, you know, you got Iran, who the majority is Shia, right? And the rest of the countries in that area, the majority is Sunni. So how do we resolve that issue? Is there a resolve, and can we play a part in that? And Mr. Ambassador, you've had the ability to deal with those over the years. What's your take?
I've had about 30 years counting Turkey in the region or working on the region, and I was just out there and talked to the leaders of Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey over the past month. I like the area. It's fascinating, and it doesn't have to be what we see right now. And there are times when it hasn't. For example, the Shia-Sunni split and the conflicts that emerged from them, which I was so worried about, I put considerable time into it in my written testimony as a accelerant for terrorism in this region. That is something that, while it's been latent before, these people, Sunni and Shia Arabs and other ethnic groups with that split, have lived together in relative peace for most of the history of the Middle East. It's something that can go back together, just like Orthodox and Muslims lived in peace in Bosnia and other places in the Balkans for centuries, and then bang, in the 1990s, what happened? A breakdown in order, an unwillingness of the international community to engage, and the evil forces that are always latent bubble up and become omnipresent. We have that with a vengeance right now in the region. But again, while we can't go in and fix it per se, the region itself can fix it if given enough time and given enough stability. Our job from the outside, and it's not something we can do alone, we need to do it with our European friends and our allies and partners in the region, is to dampen down the exploitation of this violence and insecurity by forces, beginning with terrorist forces, Iran, and at times even our own friends who get carried away in responding to these threats. But that takes a very present United States, not with whole armies, not with hundreds of billions of dollars a year in expenditures, but the kind of presence that over most of the period since the 1970s we've been able to do in the region and with relative success. Over the long term, I'm optimistic, but I realize it may be a hard sell today.
Well, I mean, we tend to want to force our view of government on other governments. And I think we saw that with Saddam Hussein, with, I mean, all the dictators out there. And we want to impose what we think is the proper form of government. And not every country or people are ready for democracy as we see it for a number of reasons. And Iran, obviously, you've touched on it. Iran is a huge player, and I agree with your testimony that we can't just leave a void there and allow Iran to fill that. If we abandon the Middle East, what are we going to get? And I think we've seen part of it. And Lieutenant Colonel Price, I'm very interested
having two sons that went to West Point, on your take in regards to what are we trying to impart upon our future leaders and our leaders within the military as to how we go about this? Because we do have the ability militarily to do certain things, but I don't know that, and we've talked about, we don't have the will in the United States nor the money to continue. What's your take?
Yes, so very, very briefly, sir, one of the reasons why the organization that I lead was stood up was for that very reason. When I was a cadet, we did not have any type of formal education when it came to these types of topics, whether it's terrorism, counterinsurgency. These are complex issues that our young American servicemen and women are facing.
You know, my son was a plebe when the Twin Towers went down, where he just finished his plebe year. So you're right, we didn't have a whole lot of experience in that, but I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yes, sir. So a part of this is learning about these topics in a more academically rigorous session. The other things that we've done is we've enhanced the Academy's overseas programs to get more cultural education to our cadets. But ultimately, at the end of the day, and this is not specific to the U.S. Military Academy or others, but it's teaching our young military leaders how to think and not what to think. That's all.
I appreciate it. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bridenstine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ambassador Jeffrey, you were our ambassador during the withdrawal from Iraq. You were our ambassador to Iraq. I wasn't in Congress at the time, but I was in the military. And what we were being told at the time was that there was no status of forces agreement ratified by the Iraqi parliament, and therefore we had to pull out. That was the talking point that we heard over and over again. Currently, we have 5,000 troops in Iraq. Did the parliament ratify a status of forces agreement? And if not, how do we have 5,000 troops there now?
And that's a good question, Congressman. Give me a second to track this back, because I was involved in this first in the White House in the Bush administration and then on the field in the Obama administration. As part of our authorities in Iraq up until 2008 were based on a UN Security Council resolution. The Iraqi government in 2008 said, this has got to end. So President Bush then went in and got a status of forces agreement that gave us immunities for our troops. But the cost of that was to get it through the Iraqi parliament, and everybody agreed that it had to go through the Iraqi parliament to be legally binding, was we had to put a limit on how long we would stay. So that limit was the end of 2011. Obama administration came in, and then after General Austin and I...
So in 2008, it did go through what was...
It did go through the parliament, that's right, sir.
Okay.
Then in 2010, General Austin and I came to Iraq, and soon we said, hey, we don't want to do a withdrawal in 18 months. Let's recommend that we keep troops on. We went back and forth with the administration. President Obama brought us in and said, okay, we'll try to negotiate a new status of forces agreement. With one exception, all of his advisors, and all of them at the top two tiers, said, yeah, we have to get one through Parliament because the last one went through Parliament, and in a democratic system, it really won't have legal, because what you're doing with a status of forces agreement is saying, Jim, or you as a soldier, Congresswoman, are exempt from the laws of a country.
Right.
It's not something...
Critically important.
Yeah, it's critically important, but it's something that it takes either diplomatic status, which is a treaty, or it takes something that has to be legally binding in a state like Iraq under that constitution. That's the parliament. So our position was we need a status of force agreement. In the end, the Iraqis said, okay, we can put up with troops in country, but we don't want to give you a status of forces agreement that will go through the parliament because, hey, the Russians didn't need this. Why do you need it? And Prime Minister Maliki said, I'll just sign a document. Everybody, with one exception, concluded that that wasn't acceptable, so we went without the troops at the end of 2011. Then in 2014, under very different emergency conditions, the president decided that he could live with essentially, and I haven't seen the document, but I know it exists, an executive agreement that our troops will have, to the extent possible, immunities. I don't know what the language. It's pretty threadbare. The difference is when you have an emergency where a foreign horrific force has gobbled up a third of your country and killed tens of thousands of your citizens, probably we can send forces in an emergency basis without those same legal protections because the country dramatically needs us. In 2011, when the troops left, Congressman, there was almost no fighting in country. Iraqis were not quite sure why we wanted to stay on. That was my concern, that we would be harassed by, for example, Sadrist police, extremist judges, and other things, and therefore we needed that protection. Now,
that's more clarity than I've had on that the entire time I've been here. So thank you. That's a great answer.
Thank you.
I've got just maybe a minute left. Colonel Price, how important is human intelligence to winning this fight?
I think it's absolutely critical, and I think that it has led to a lot of our counterterrorism successes since 2001.
Real quick, do you know offhand how many prisoners, how many ISIS prisoners we've captured?
No, sir, I wouldn't be able to answer that.
A couple months ago, I asked the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and they gave me one. Do you know if we've captured any more than that since then?
I don't know, sir.
Is that important to being able to get human intelligence?
So your question is that taking prisoners is important to
That's my question.
Getting intelligence?
Yes.
Yes, I think that you can glean information from captured terrorists. Yes, sir.
Okay. We've had a conversation about hard power and soft power. You talked about public-private partnerships. One thing I'd like to get on record, are you familiar with the Overseas Private Investment Corporation?
No, sir.
Anyone else on the panel familiar with it? Can you guys talk about whether or not that's important and if it's something we as members of Congress should be involved in making sure continues?
It's really good bang for the buck. I've dealt with it. It's been a long time. I can't talk specifics, but it's one of the things we sort of smile when we hear about our government doing abroad as opposed to other things that we're a little skeptical about, that are bigger, clumsier, and don't get money out.
Okay. Mr. Jenkins?
Absolutely. It's extremely useful in providing the assurance that we need, not to put aside insurance, but the assurance that investors need and traders need to make this work. I would agree with the ambassador. It's a big bang for the buck.
That's good to know. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Bryan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen. I think I'm the end here, so that's the good news for you. I want to go to the topic of our allies in the Middle East. I think, if not explicit, implicit in all of your testimony is we can't do this alone. I'm concerned about the relationship we presently have with our allies. Some of us have been over there and talked to our allies. We certainly read things that they've been saying. It seems that they're worried that we have gotten too close to Iran at their expense. And so I'd like for you to speak to this notion that we have to pick who we're going to be with. In other words, is it the situation where we can have a relationship with Iran and cause problems thereby with our other allies, our Gulf allies, our Saudi Arabia allies, our Jordanian, Egyptian allies? Or can you thread that needle where, yeah, you can have some sort of a relationship with Iran and still have that very strong, important, positive relationship with our allies? There's some of us that are worried that we're leaving the girl we brought to the dance and going off dancing with another girl, and that's not a good thing. Or perhaps better to say that. We're in a fight, and we've left our friends in the fight and gone to our adversary in the fight. I might also add that I'd like, if you can, talk a little bit there also about how we're presently treating the president of Egypt, Mr. El-Sisi, who has in many ways been very strong in advocating our interests in that region. So if you could speak to our relationship with our allies and whether it's in the right place or whether it needs to change.
If I could start, as I said, I've just been in the region and I've talked to Prime Minister Netanyahu, the head of the Israeli opposition, to the King of Saudi Arabia, the Crown Prince, Deputy Crown Prince, and to President Erdogan. And everybody is echoing exactly what you're saying, Congressman, that they want more American presence in the region, military, diplomatic, political, obviously economic, but they focus on diplomatic, and they want a stronger position against Iran. Now, I mentioned earlier both Iran as a source of basically pushing the area more into terror, but also as someone in Iraq and elsewhere we have to deal with, and we do have to deal with it. We had to deal with it one or another way on the nuclear account. We have to deal with it in its presence in the region. But here's where I draw the line. There are countries, however flawed, that support the international status quo and want us in the region. Egypt is a good example. Turkey is another, however difficult. Secondly, there are countries that, while we may have to deal with them on things, ultimately don't want us there and want a different Middle East. That's ISIS. That's Iran. And therefore, how we deal with them has to be different. We had relations with the Soviet Union for 40 years. We did agreement after agreement with them, but we never lost sight of the fact they and we have totally different visions of the world. We in Iran have totally different visions of how the Middle East should be shaped up, and lest we forget that, we open the door to exactly the kind of problem you've described.
Let me underscore that. I think there was a sense of perhaps ill-founded euphoria when we signed the deal with Iran that this would be the beginning of rapprochement and good relations. This was a deal. And the notion of some type of rapprochement, and ultimately some even spoke about strategic partnership in the region, I think is something that may be decades down the road, if ever. It is not clear that the Iranians are interested in that at all. I think in terms of dealing with our traditional allies, as flawed as they are in the region, I think we have caused them consternation, not simply because of the arrangement with Iran, but because of some of our inconstant behavior as we went through this turbulent Arab Spring, and that caused them
the red line, et cetera.
Various things, a whole list of things, so that the notion was, their concern was, if they face a threat, an overt, obvious threat, we would probably come and assist them. A more insidious kind of a threat, we would probably give them a lecture on human rights and democracy and so on. And so that caused them to be greatly concerned. Now, I'm not saying we ought not to be committed to those things of human rights, of democracy, and so on, but we also have to accept that these are not values that we can automatically export and impose on others or demand as preconditions for any type of relationship. And therefore, I think that we have not been as successful as we could be in exploiting some of the initiatives that have come out of the local partners that we might do, including some of the Gulf countries.
Thank you. My time is up, but I hate not to let Colonel Price respond to that, Mr. Chairman. Colonel, could you respond to that?
Sir, I wouldn't have anything to add to what the other two panelists have already said. Thank you, though.
Ambassador Jeffery, you don't have to comment on this if you don't have an opinion, but your conversation with Mr. Bridenstine on the Iraq Status of Our Forces Agreement leads me to think about an issue that we have before us now, and that is the bill that allows victims of terrorism to sue in court other nations, conduct discovery, and so forth. The United States has more people in more countries around the world than anybody else, and one of the arguments that leads to concerns about that is that when you start eroding sovereign immunity, then that is a slippery slope that puts our people in greater danger. Do you have an opinion about this? And again, this is kind of out of the blue, but if you want to, fine.
I have a very strong opinion, Mr. Chairman. Normally, I'm 90%, 10%, 70%, 30%. There's a few issues I'm 100% on. This is a really big mistake. This will open the door potentially to legal action against Americans by, criminal courts in other countries, criminal in the sense of corrupt in criminal courts in other countries. It will risk the diplomatic immunity that people like me needed to work in very difficult countries, communist Bulgaria, for example, in the 1980s. I've seen up close what they were trying to do to us and how we wrapped ourselves in that immunity. This I cannot, totally apart from the importance of Saudi Arabia in the fight against terror and the competition with Iran, against any country, this would be a mistake. It opens the door to extraordinary threats to Americans of a legal nature around the world. Thank you for asking me.
Well, no, I appreciate it. Those are some of my concerns as well. One thing we hadn't really talked about today, and in my memory, was the dominant shadow overhanging 9/11, and that was, what if terrorists get their hands on weapons of mass destruction? We have seen ISIS use chemical weapons. It has been made public that al-Qaeda, among others, have worked on biological sorts of weapons. Do any of you have any comments about that prospect, how that might change the way we view terrorism, et cetera?
I think that any use by terrorists of chemical, biological, radiological, let alone nuclear weapons, would have a profound effect on public psychology. I hesitate to call them weapons of mass destruction because I think there is a range there. And when we look at what they were experimenting or what capacities have, the capacity, while it may be, chemical weapons may be more accessible, the capacity would be quite limited, while radiological is one that is frequently mentioned, the so-called a dirty bomb. In looking at that from an operational standpoint, the bomb part, that is the explosion, would be the source of casualties far more than the radioactive component, which is likely to be very small quantities of radioactive material. These are really weapons where the terrorists use them to achieve not so much physical effects, but maximum psychological effects. And so beyond taking all reasonable measures to try to ensure that they don't have that capacity, ranging from improving security as well as intervening in a preemptive fashion to ensure that if we have any operational intelligence that they are moving in that direction, we head it off. Beyond that, there is a real issue of how we would address such an event if it occurred, heaven forbid, and that has a lot to do with how we will handle the media, societal resilience. If we look at the psychological effects in our saturated media environment that we operate in and concerns of what has happened in even ordinary conventional attacks, whether it's Orlando or the more recent events, one really worries about the kind of frenzy that would be fueled if they were to get these weapons. So I'm less concerned about the physical aspects of it than the psychological impact, which is what terror is all about.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, which I guess leads me to my last question, Colonel Price. Optimistic scenarios say that Iraqi military, with our help, clears ISIS out of Mosul and Iraq. It's hard for me to see how they get cleared out of Syria in the foreseeable future. But as I mentioned at the beginning, ISIS itself says, okay, we may lose our physical caliphate, but we are going to remain in the virtual caliphate. Can you comment on that? Does that mean a diminished danger? Does that, just how big a deal is that if ISIS continues on in a virtual sense, and are we equipped to deal with that? I mean, you've talked about the public-private partnerships to fight the ideology, but talk a little about a virtual caliphate.
Yes, sir, and this goes back to my earlier points regarding the difficulties and challenges of saying you're going to destroy the Islamic State. While you can remove their military capability, their ability to inspire and potentially direct attacks with those that are outside of the theater of combat operations poses a significant threat to others. As Mr. Jenkins also alluded to earlier, the pathways of radicalization are extremely complex. And so this is an area where I think that academics will need to do a better job of providing more policy-relevant, specific recommendations to bodies like this in that regard. The danger posed with the advent of the internet now is that there is no geographic limitations to where this threat can reside. And so those are the challenges that I see moving forward.
Okay, thank you all very much. Helpful and yet challenging. And I think that's kind of what the country faces going ahead. But thank you all for being here. With that, the hearing stands adjourned.
Thank you.
That was terrific. And on the civil litigation, this bill, which we feel 100% about, well, I couldn't agree more. The idea of turning diplomacy over to civil litigation, civil courts, and for litigators, to me is